Well, I see people still coming into the room, but I will just start with a brief introduction. A very warm welcome to you all this evening to the online discussion, Translators, Robots in Disguise, the Future of Literary Translations and Artificial Intelligence. My name is Gosia Zabaj. I'm the Head of Information at the Goethe Institute in London. And the topic of artificial intelligence and its influence on the arts has been one of the main focus topics of the Goethe Institute in the past few years. And especially in the translation field, the use of artificial intelligence or machine translation, you might say as well, to translate literature, has until now been mostly debated and researched mainly in academic circles and not necessarily amongst literary translators themselves. And some of you might remember the inaugural lecture by Duncan Large at the University of East Anglia in the year 2017 with the title, "Could Google Translate Shakespeare?" But since then, there have been significant technological developments that allow us to rephrase this question. Could Google translate Shakespeare well? We covered the technological background as well as an update on Duncan Large perspective on our website, which address you can see on my background image, goethe.de/UK/AI translation. And another expert we interview, Lucia Specia, a chair in natural language processing at Imperial College London, is also debating with us tonight. So the aim of this event is to help build a bridge between the academic world and the world of literary translation. And the Goethe Institute London will focus further on the subject next year with a big program on the topic of artificial intelligence, translation, and bias. Let me briefly do some housekeeping. This event is bound to last 1 hour, and the speakers during the event will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on our website later. And I've seen some of you have already discovered the Q&A section on the bottom of the Zoom program. Please post your questions during and comments during the session. You also have a possibility to vote on questions you find most interesting. That will be very helpful for us to then choose the question we will ask after the initial discussion. This event is a part of celebrations of the International Translation Day. We just, felt it would be nice to make the celebration last even a bit longer. And therefore, I would like to thank our partners, English Pen, the National Center for Writing, the Weltlesebühne, and to my colleague Anne-Marie Goodrich from the Goethe Institute London, who put this whole event together. And of course, the biggest thanks go to our three panelists, Katy, Derbyshire, Lucia Specia, and Duncan Large. I wish you all a pleasant and insightful evening, and let me pass to Katy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gosia. My name's Katy Derbyshire, and I'm a literary translator. I'm in Berlin right now, which is where I live. I translate contemporary German writers, and I'm also a brand new publisher with an imprint called V&Q Books. We're bringing what we call remarkable writing from Germany to the UK and Ireland. Let me introduce the other two. I'll start with Duncan Large, who I would like to say is to my right, but maybe he's on a different place on your screens. He's the academic director of the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. He's a professor of European Literature and Translation at UEA and chairs the Petra E network of European Literary Translation training institutions. He co-edits the new monograph series Routledge Studies in Literary Translation and is co-general editor of the complete works of Friedrich Nietzsche for Stanford University Press. Lucia Specia is our other guest today, Professor of Natural Language Processing at Imperial College London and also part-time at the Universities of Sheffield and Dublin City University. Her research, as we'll hear more about, focuses on various aspects of data-driven approaches to language processing, with a particular interest in multimodal and multilingual context models and work at the intersection of language and vision. We're going to start with Lucia, who's going to give us a quick introduction to her main points, followed by Duncan straight after that, and then we'll have some questions, and at the end we've set aside a good 10 or 15 minutes for audience questions, which Gosha will help me with. So Lucia, let me hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Katy. Can you hear me okay? Good. Right, so hopefully the message that I want to bring across is on why literary translators should not be too worried about machine translation / AI and how that's going to take their jobs away. So I've been working in this area for now over 20 years. It's one of my main research topics. And indeed, there's been a lot of progress, as it was mentioned, and especially if we compare the technology that we have today with what we had in the very, very beginning, which is back in the 50s, where the first system to translate text had about 6 grammar rules and could translate 250 words from Russian into English. As you can imagine, that was very limited. So the technology has come a long way. And there has been very big claims by very big players in the area, especially in industry. And you might have seen this in some news or blogs back in 2016. For example, Google claimed that they were bridging the gap between human and machine translation. And then about 2 years later, in 2018, Microsoft claimed that they had achieved human parity on automatic translation. And then just a year later, Facebook claimed that they had surpassed human quality in the sense that machine translation was even better than humans. And they're obviously, these are industry players, and they have interest in selling translations and translation systems. And there have been other papers showing that this is not quite right, or it's not always right. And it's certainly not right for all language pairs and all types of data. But indeed, if you've played with any of these online systems, and even if you tried the quiz that is on the event website, you have seen that the systems are pretty decent. And they can get a lot of the content right in a number of languages, especially the languages for which there has a lot of translation data out there to build the systems. And there are essentially 3 main reasons why the technology works so well nowadays. One of them is data. So these systems are essentially built on examples of translations that are produced by humans. And there is a lot of this data available electronically nowadays, such as books in various languages. The other reasons is more related to the actual algorithms behind the current technology. So the AI algorithms or the neural translation models, as you might have heard. And these are very good models. They generalize data very well. So they're able to put together words that have been seen in different sentences to translate a new sentence that they hadn't seen before, at least not in the exact same way. So these are very good memorization machines, one could say. And then there's compute power, which is also something that happened recently, and there's a lot more of that and a lot cheaper as well. However, again, if you played with these tools, you will have noticed that they're not bulletproof. And there's a number of very nice examples again in the quiz. I would really recommend that you try it, especially example number 3. You see how interesting that is. It's something to do with smell, and I'm not going to try and replicate it because I want you to go and do the quiz, but also because I can't read German. But it's very interesting. And again, there are various reasons why technology fails. And I think I wanted to highlight the ones that I think are the most important ones. And also these are reasons sort of behind my argument on why we shouldn't be too afraid of the technology. So the main reason, I think, when it comes to thinking about this technology as a replacement for humans is that it's still unpredictable. Similar to our neurons and our brain, these neural systems are sort of black box systems. We can't really trick them. We can't really understand them, which is fine. This is how our brain works as well, except that our brain is a much better machine than these neural models. And the consequence of it being unpredictable is that sometimes things go really wrong. So we have what we call this catastrophic errors, which are cases where you can't even imagine why the models have produced what they've produced. And you can't really think that that would be useful or usable in any situation. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is the fact that the way the technology works is essentially built on examples of sentences that are translated by humans, and the best case, slightly longer paragraphs, but never a book. You would never build a system that has seen, for example, as a single piece, an entire Shakespeare book or an entire whatever book. This systems just don't have the ability to take all of that into account at once. So we have to break it down, make the smaller pieces, and then teach the models how to sort of try and generalize from that. And context is everything, and we know that. And context also means consistency. So translating the same content in the same way, if you see it again throughout, say, a book. And the third reason, which is very important, is that these models lack creativity. And even though I say they're very good memory machines or memorization machines, that means that they can go and fetch things that they've translated before and maybe put these bits and pieces together, but they can't create anything new. And that's part of the main difference between what humans can do and what these machines can do. So if I were to summarize in terms of the usefulness of this technology and the threat that they can pose to translators, so I would say, obviously, the technology is not entirely useless. It can be used to translate a lot of content and content types, especially easy, repetitive content such as technical documentation, even news articles. It's pretty decent if the vocabulary is known enough, like if the names of people mentioned there have been seen before. And it's also good as a way of generating a draft translation for other types of content, although there is a risk there that the translator who was then asked to fix or to edit this draft might then become biased to keep it too close to the sort of more literal translation that the machine has given him or her. So I would say, if you wanted to, as a translator, to sort of answer this question on whether you're, depending on the type of content that you translate, on whether your job would be at risk, and this is according to my personal point of view, I would ask you to sort of ask yourself this question and think about whether the work that you do is more than going to sort of an enormous or gigantic database and fetching previously translated partial segments and putting them together. If it's not more than that, then I would say, yeah, there is a risk that these models are going to replace your job. But if your job is more creative and there is a lot more than just fetching previously translated content and putting it together, then I would say it's not a job that's at risk. And it probably won't be in the next, I wouldn't even put a number there because I don't think technology will ever get there. Okay.
I'm breathing a huge sigh of relief, thank you. And just move straight on to Duncan.
Thank you, Katy. Thank you, Lucia, for that wonderful tour d'horizon of where we are at the moment. You started off by saying, well, you came to kind of reassure translators that their jobs were safe. I suppose I agree with your perspective in so many ways. Perhaps I could summarize my take, though, by saying that really I'm interested in why literary translators should nonetheless be interested in machine translation and what it can offer literary translation both now and potentially in the future. I come to these issues from the perspective of a translator, a teacher of translation, of translation history, translation theory. I've been interested in computers, I suppose, since the early 1980s, and in the ways in which computers can help translators since at least the 1990s, when I was co-teaching in my previous university, Swansea, with Andrew Rothwell, who was particularly interested in computer-assisted translation, and we co-taught a module together, and I was fascinated to see just how far machine translation had come by that stage already in the 1990s, but the answer was quite far, but really nowhere near far enough for literary translation. Throughout the 1990s into the 2000s, I used to use machine translated examples as examples of how not to do it, and get my students to kind of pick over, well, what's going wrong here? And that's, you know, a lot of hilarity ensued. And there are some interesting, of course, things that one can learn from the mistakes. But I think really it's probably from that sort of time that literary translators have tended to continue feeling, well, there's nothing really much here for us, nothing that we need to pay attention to, nothing that computers can really help us with, aside from the obvious things like online glossaries and corpora and dictionaries. When I came to UEA in 2014, we soon joined a European network called Petra E, which you mentioned, Katy, in your introduction. And that brings together a variety, about over 20 now, literary translation training organizations. And we worked initially on a framework document outlining stages towards the training and professional development of literary translators, and that was published in 2016. And I look back now, and already I'm feeling, gosh, there's really very little about computers in there, and I think there ought to have been more, and certainly next iteration of that document we will have, I think, more in there, because things are moving very quickly in this field. Google Translate coming in 2006 already was a real game changer, and then 10 years later, 2016, the adoption of the neural machine translation model, again a kind of, if one might say, quantum leap in the usefulness of these technologies. So when I came to UEA, I gave that inaugural lecture, Could Google Translate Shakespeare? And in a way, the question was already a bit otiose, because, and I answered it during the lecture, I said, well, yes, of course, Google can translate Shakespeare, just not very well. And it still can't translate Shakespeare very well. And in a way, that's kind of the wrong question to ask, because that's kind of setting the bar at the highest level you can, expecting fully automated, high quality machine translation of a text like Shakespeare, which is older English dramatic verse. That's setting the bar kind of crazily high, really, in some ways. And for the last few years, it's already been possible for machine translation engines under quite a number of constraints, but nonetheless, if you give plainer prose texts, contemporary language to machine translation engines, they can make a pretty good fist of it. And so when I was asked to contribute to the dossier and to this event this evening, I thought, well, let's revisit the literary examples and see just what machine translation engines can currently do. So in my piece for the dossier, I use the opening of Kafka's short story Die Verwandlung, which most of us know as the Metamorphosis, but can be translated otherwise, the transformation, for example. And I was interested to see, one, how well actually that opening sentence is translated by a wide variety of free online machine translation engines. That's a good sign. The slightly worrying sign for me was, and this was a surprise to me, how homogeneous the translations were. And there's very little variety among the translations that were being offered by the computers. And I think that's one danger, that the kind of variety, and I give lots of examples from human translators of that sentence and other parts of the book, that kind of variety which we're used to from human translators. That's kind of why we read several translations, because we expect there will be variety there. And the different machine translation engines are kind of converging on a single translation, largely for, I think, statistical reasons. And that translation is pretty good. It would be usable. But once you start moving beyond a single sentence, as Lucia was already saying, then the problems start arising, and the shortcomings of the machines become relevant. So certainly the existing research literature suggests, which have used far longer and more complex examples than my little one, suggests that machines are really still a long way off being able to produce good literary translations at the touch of a button. And the jury's out on whether that's going to change anytime soon. Lucia says she's not expecting that to change at all. I think there are, yes, good reasons for that, the reasons that Lucia gave. Once you get a kind of good enough or quite good translation, the kind of the final 5 or 10% making it a really good translation on a par with humans is, it takes such a lot of additional effort, whether it be computing power, whether it be the finance to be invested in developing these systems and developing them specifically for literary translation use, because so many of these machine translation systems have not been developed for literary translation use. And it's not surprising in a way that they in some cases still produce very poor quality output. So I think there's a question about, well, can we extrapolate? Can we say, well, the current models, is it going to be just a sort of incremental progress, or do we need another game changer to make these machine-produced literary translations usable? Because when we're talking about literary translation, the good enough is really not good enough. We don't want a translation which kind of is nearly there and creaks and it's no fun to read and we kind of see the joins, and that's not what we read literature for. So, if it can't do better than that, then we're never going to get there. I think then I agree with Lucia that there's going to be a need for human translators, certainly for the foreseeable future, further into the far distant future. I raised a question in my piece whether we would want it otherwise, whether we would actually want a post-human literary translation world. Clearly, as translators, the answer would be no. I'm suggesting that I suggest an analogy with chess, where even when computers have got in chess a lot better than humans, nonetheless humans can still make a living out of playing chess. There are still lots of things for human chess players to do. And so I'm tempted by the speculation, well, let's kind of assume that let's give computers the benefit of the doubt. Let's say, okay, well, we don't want to give hostages to fortune here. Let's say that there's going to come a time, perhaps it's centuries hence, when computers can, pass that Turing test, when computers can simulate human translation well enough to be mistaken for humans. Well, what then? Well, my answer is, well, I think humans will still be required to, apart from anything, Gosha, in her introduction, was introducing the program of the Goethe Institute next year, looking at bias in these automated translations, and that's a big issue, and that's something that human translators, I think, will always be needed for. I suggest also in my piece that human translators will, it's not a magic bullet for publishers, for example, to imagine that there'll come a point where they can just press the button and bypass human translators altogether. There are going to be quality constraints even much further down the line. And I think also just from the sheer pleasure that literary translation can give, I don't say it always gives, but it can give to the literary translator, that's something which, you know, we won't want to dispense with, we won't want to give up on. And a final point then, really, I'm interested in this question, not simply from the point of view of kind of crystal ball gazing and thinking, well, will computers, won't they get good enough to oust or to vie with human translators? I'm interested in, well, what can we learn from these questions now as human translators? What if we engage in these, to some extent, thought experiments and think about, well, what if? What does that tell us about how humans translate now, and what it is about human translation now that is different from the machinic? You know, what is it about human translation that is not likely to or never going to be replaced by machines? And I think I would join Lucia in suggesting that creativity is the key there, and that's the thing really which humans will always bring to translation, or should always be able to bring to translation, can bring to translation. And so I finished my inaugural lecture, for example, by urging translators to become more creative. There are ways in which, of course, machines can simulate certain kinds of creativity. And I'm not sure whether, even if machines can learn a certain kind of creativity, that's not a bad thing, because humans are learning from the machines all the time.
Thank you, Duncan. I love that you mentioned the pleasure. There's the dossier. I want to call everyone's attention to the dossier if you haven't read it. There's a number of articles, and one of them is particularly good by Alana Cullen, who writes, just explains basically the background in a very clear way, which I enjoyed a lot. I will take issue with one thing that she says, though. She says that machine translation can take over the tiresome legwork for literary translators. And for me, there is no tiresome legwork involved, you know. So I was glad to hear you repeat that about the pleasure. I'm going to take us back a little bit because I've been thinking about really quite radical changes that have happened in our translation practice over the past 20 years. Really only the generation of translators before me, they were still working with paper dictionaries. They would ring up the local fishmonger to ask questions about fish. They had to request interlibrary loans to do their research. They were exchanging letters by post with their writers. Really, the whole process has changed hugely. And I want to ask you, Duncan, whether that technological progress we've made has led to literary translations being better now?
I suppose I'd come back to your point about legwork. And I mean, surely those examples you gave about sort of needing to, I remember when I was doing my first book in the 90s, and it wasn't so much the translation itself as I was doing a bibliography to accompany it. And that was a lot of tiresome legwork, going to the library and looking up things which are just so much quicker to achieve now. In translation itself, I think the automation of a lot of translation processes does create kind of headspace for if you like, the higher tasks of the translator, the areas where creativity can come in. I think already, and I'm interested in Roy Udell, for example, his piece for the dossier suggests that actually, I mean, we're talking here about artificial intelligence, about machine translation, but computer-assisted translation can already, well, it's an absolute necessity for translators in other fields. And Roy's he demonstrates very well that actually literary translators can already gain a lot from computer assistance, and that's time saving as well. So does it produce better translations? Well, I think being able to save time in certain parts of the translation process gives time then to revise, to revisit, and to think about what I was suggesting are kind of the parts that computers can't yet reach, and where the human, what I call the kind of the human premium, is still important. So I think yes, to answer your question, I think yes, translations have been improved.
I agree, actually. I think the same. Just, and that's another reason why I think these retranslations of previously translated works are an interesting and good thing. And even just on the communication level with our writers, I think we're, you know, if like me, you're translating contemporary writers, it's a huge boon to be able to talk to them in almost real time. I did a little informal survey in the Facebook group of working literary translators about their current practice, and most of them don't at the moment use either CAT tools or machine translation. A few of them were considering it, so I got 139 replies, 101 of whom were going no, said no, and 6 of those 139 people were willing to admit, at least, that they do use neural machine translation for literary work. I wanted to ask both of you, actually, maybe start with you, Lucia, how you imagine literary translators might be working in another 10 years' time, if we extrapolate from the thought that the progress we've made so far has made translations better. What do you think, Lucia?
Yeah, so I do believe that, as Duncan suggested, it can be a useful tool already as is. I would say it's still quite dependent on the type of literary translation. Like if you're translating poetry, I would say just don't even go there. But if you're translating other types of text, then I think it is a tool. But it would still worry me a bit, the fact that it brings its own issues, biases being one of them, and it's not clear to me whether it would be more work to then sort of try and get to the version that you get from the machine into what would be a creative, unbiased, contextualized, and everything version versus starting from scratch. And I guess it also depends on the level of I don't know, experience and the proficiency of the translator and the task. I would assume that junior translators would benefit a lot more from the technology than potentially more senior translators who can do the job without the tools a lot faster. But yes, in other areas, which I have worked a lot with translators in not literary translation, but more technical translation and related areas, legal, IT, life science. So they're still fairly challenging areas with a lot of terminology. And there it seems to be the case that there is definitely a correlation between the usefulness of the technology and the level of experience of the translator, and also the level of experience with the so-called post-editing, which would be fixing the translation. So there is these 3 things on top of the type of data that has to be translated. And I think it would be at least worth a try, because there's no cost in principle to just give it a go using one of these online systems. And yeah, I mean, and I just wanted to add one thing that might disappoint Duncan a little bit on his Kafka example. which might also be the case for Shakespeare. And I was just playing a bit with Shakespeare into Portuguese with some famous quotes. A lot of this data is already part of the training data of these models. So when you get a very good translation for a book that has been around for a long time, chances are that the model has seen this text already, and it's still not going to be perfect because it's not simply copying and pasting, but it's actually copying bits and then placing them together in different ways. Yeah, I think there would be quite a difference between translating a completely new literary text and translating a fairly old book, which is already basically anyone can use the text, and that's also potentially one of the reasons why there's this, you notice this convergence between the different technologies, that Google, DeepL, and others, sort of generating very similar translations. It is likely that a lot of their data is similar because it's just data that's on the web. And it's very true that the technology is also, the algorithms are very similar, but the data, which is critical in this case, is likely to be very similar. And the ones that do better are the ones that have more data. And that's yeah, just an observation there, which might disappoint a lot of you when you get a nice translation for Shakespeare, Kafka.
Duncan, do you have a different vision of where we'll be in 10 years?
In 10 years, well, perhaps I could just pick up on Lucia's last point there. Yes, well, I'm struck by the notion of a continuum in two senses, really. One is what we mean by literary translation in the first place. And I suggested, well, kind of Shakespeare's at one end, perhaps, and Lucia's given the example of poetry. And there are clearly there are some kinds of literary texts which lend themselves better to being translated by machines than others. I talked earlier about a kind of plainer prose style, perhaps, and those are the kinds of material that those who are researching into literary machine translation have tended to use first, because it's kind of understandable. You would expect, and it is indeed the case, that machines would work better with those examples. There's a kind of continuum then, and I suppose I see it as machines sort of gradually creeping from from one end to the other in the adequacy of the output that they can achieve. But there's a continuum as well, which Lucia has just alluded to, in this whole kind of computers versus humans opposition. Anyway, it's a false opposition. It is a continuum. For some time now, the machines have been using human input, really from the start, of course. I mean, the machines are programmed by humans. And more specifically then, the example Lucia just gave about, yes, these my Kafka passage, there are plenty of translations out there, and they've fed into the machine translation engines that then produced the outputs, which are remarkably similar to or on a par with human output. So yes, there's a kind of a loop there, really. But I think I would call it a continuum then between the humans and the machines. Where that goes next, I gave one example from the kind of wilder reaches of speculation on this, from Mark O. Thomas, who envisages a future situation where a computer might be able to kind of absorb all the translations that a particular human translator has done in their lifetime, and then even be able posthumously to generate new ones in the same style. That's certainly a long way off. I think it's an interesting speculation. More concretely, in the next 10 years, I think it was certainly surprising when Google Translate came out in 2006 with a statistical machine translator that was so clearly much better than the other things that were around at the time and then did the same again 10 years later. So one can't rule out the game-changing technical advance that's just round the corner. For 10 years, we need to think more incrementally, though. And I'd like to think that human translators will be able to use computers more. I mean, we're already, of course, in other parts of our lives, we're using machine translation routinely now in ways that we would just never have dreamt of, really, even 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. And the ways in which kind of real-time translation on the fly between certain language pairs in certain situations and so on is now possible. That is startling. It's astonishing. It's made such a huge difference. There are repercussions, of course, massive repercussions for academia about, well, how do we cope with machine translation with our students? You know, we're used to saying that we're used to setting students exercises and then expecting them to go away and sit with a paper dictionary and come back with a version that's all their own. I mean, for one thing, as you said, paper dictionaries are long gone for most translators' in most translators' real experience. But how do we deal with the availability of the easy availability of machine translation in that context? And academia hasn't really got to grips with that, I think. So there are ways in which these ripples are still working their way through, and certainly it'll take 10 years for even at that level for the impact of machine translation to be truly not just felt but accommodated.
I have one last question, and I'm going to open the Q&A section, as such, so to speak. I think we have to bear in mind that we're speaking as people who live in the UK or work in English, and so little gets translated into English that I think that the literary translation world feels a bit rarefied. But if you think about how much gets translated out of English, I looked up today a random example of a romance author called Caitlin Cruz. She has 57 titles available in German. They're kind of Mills and Boon, and people are translating this work and this writing, and for a long time, actually, they weren't allowed. The people who translated the kind of Mills and Boon type literature weren't actually allowed into the German Translators Association. They campaigned to be allowed, which helped them to earn better money. But I wonder for those kind of books that I don't want to cast aspersions on any particular writer, so I'm going to use a writer who no longer writes as my example, which is Francine Pascal. I don't know if you were familiar with the Sweet Valley High series, which was 181 teen romance novels over 20 years. They were written by a team of ghostwriters. And I think if some of them were translated into other languages, including German, I think, well, being a hard-nosed publisher, this afternoon, I phrased the question differently. I was going to ask you, well, shall I go into business and feed these Mills and Boons into Google Translate or DeepL? What I think now, later in the evening, will there be these opportunities for early career translators to get the experience that may not be as challenging, or will publishing notice this time-saving, money-saving opportunity and take that starting platform away from younger translators? I'll just ask you, Duncan.
Okay. I think, I mean, a number of things perhaps to say there. Yes, genre fiction. You know, I talked about a kind of sliding scale before, with Shakespeare at one end. Well, what's at the other end? I mean, is it something like genre fiction? Even if you say that genre fiction is at the other end, it's already so complex an example that I think we underestimate how complex even the most the most undemanding in its intention kind of literary style is for the translator, and that includes for the machine translator. And so, yes, you might argue, well, Lucia was talking about the ways in which machines deal better with repetition, and yes, perhaps in genre fiction there are more repetitions, and yet genre fiction is endlessly creative in its own right, and creativity, I mean, that's what humans can bring to translation, but in the writing that we're translating and that machines we're thinking of translating, there are so many kinds of creativity in even the most mundane kinds of writing. And I include, I mean, moving away from literary examples, in a lot of the kind of commercial and technical translation, again, that's a false dichotomy between literary translation and those other kinds, because they have very often many what we might call literary hallmarks as well. So even the most mundane kind of fiction, we might say, has a lot of complexity and a lot of difficulty for the machine translator. So human translators are going to need to be post-editing. Going back to your question about what happens in the next 10 years, post-editing is, I think, the way in which this will be impacting most. It's certainly going to be impacting other kinds of translation most. Literary translation, I think, will move more in that direction, but much more slowly than in other kinds. And I thought you were going to say something else when you were talking about English. We must bear in mind, of course, as well, that Google Translate now works with over 100 languages, but there are plenty more languages out there. And in a way, the conversation we're having is necessarily rarefied in all kinds of ways. Yes, we're mainly talking about English, but even outside of the 100-odd languages that Google Translate can currently work with, there are massive constraints on the availability of corpora to train the machine translation systems to work with other languages. And so thinking about, oh gosh, how machines might translate, might replace humans, we have to add so many caveats, and the language pair is an absolutely crucial one.
Thank you. Lucia, do you want to come back on anything before I open up the Q&A?
No, there's some very interesting questions there, so I think we should go.
Okay, I'm not sure how we're going to proceed. I understand that Gosha is going to jump in. Oh, here she is.
Yeah, there are many very interesting questions in the Q&A, and some of them have been already debated within the Q&A as well, which is great. So let's maybe start with the most popular question, which was asked by Barbara Spicer, and it's about the creativity and the role of creativity in the translation. And the question is there a danger that by using machine translation to produce a draft version of a literary text, the translator's first reading is not their own? I'm thinking here of how the process is changed in terms of creativity and intuition when the first draft stage is replaced by machine translation.
I can get started from my, again, not experience with literary translation, but with other types of translations. Because another type of work that I do is to have a layer on top of this draft translations to flag potential errors. So it's again an automatic layer that tries to, we can't fix the translation model because of all of the unpredictability and so on, but we may be able to flag errors. And the reason we need this, even if there is post-editing, is exactly what was mentioned in the question, that there is a chance that because this technology is very good at producing text that reads well, that looks grammatical and fluent, but might have, first of all, even critical mistakes that are sort of buried there, and unless you read it very carefully, you don't even notice them. And then added on top of that pressure on time and lower costs costs that are assigned to these jobs. In other areas, we definitely have the risk of not only translators generating a different translation that they would otherwise if they had started from scratch, but even of them missing errors or inconsistencies that they wouldn't have if they hadn't been given that draft. Now, I guess there's this other aspects to take into account, the time and the cost, because if they're post-editing, then the costs, they'll be paid less and they'll often be given less time to do it as well. But I would say from my experience with other areas, there's definitely a risk there that this could happen.
I don't want to really say much more than that, but just from my own experience, fixing somebody else's translation can be the most frustrating experience and the most time-consuming experience. And post-editing is an art in itself, and we need to train literary post-editors if it's going to work at all.
All right, thank you.
Let me just jump in there and
Sure.
Very quickly talk about the pleasure that Duncan mentioned, which I don't have in the same way from editing on that level. Not that I've done it, but anyway, there you are.
And then we had a couple of questions and comments on what Duncan already touched on, the smaller languages. And Ralph Dahmen mentioned that, for example, Hungarian doesn't work as well as English for Google Translate. And the question that followed from Paul K was if that isn't the valuable role of the translator, basically sparkling interest in translation of neglected authors of neglected languages and literature that just don't get translated because there is not enough data to translate them through Google Translate. So what do you think?
That's a very different part of the translator's job, which of course is the non-translating work that we tend to do in the UK in discovering. I don't think that's the case everywhere. And perhaps that would be a whole different, if we're talking about shifting our skill sets and changing our skill sets, it would be great to train that part of our work, train people up in that part of our work, but also for it to be remunerated, because it's not. So it's great if we can be really good at it, but if it doesn't pay the rent, then not very helpful for us.
It's a really good point about advocacy. I would just refer to one of the references in my piece in the dossier to is an online piece by Shannon Marisligil to the International Literature Showcase from 2016, where she reflects precisely on this question about the need, even in perhaps this far off future when humans aren't needed quite so much for literary translation, but that's one of the areas where humans will always be needed. That's one of those biases which humans, I mean, we're tackling that bias only now as far as the world of human translation is concerned, and it's going to continue to be necessary however much more machines are involved. In other words, the need, yes, to bang the drum for other kinds of literature from other languages, and to make sure that this doesn't become a kind of steamroller.
And then we had a couple of questions on technical aspects, really. So I would just try to sum them up. Well, the first one was actually, how is Google Translate and DeepL different? And how is data selected for both of those tools? So are aspects like diversity, gender, age taken into account or not at all? And if you, especially Lucia, the question goes for you, if you can conceive of a way if deep learning, DeepL can apply context at some time in the future.
Okay, try and answer them all very quickly if I remember. So when it comes to the differences, which is also related to the data question, so the core technology is very similar. I think DeepL was developed by a sort of German group slash company, and they, from the beginning, they focused a lot on having clean data, meaning that they didn't want to contaminate their training data with, for example, already machine translated data, which makes its way onto the web and then gets crawled again. And also they did focus a lot on getting a good system for a subset of language, specifically in the beginning, which some people, well, this is also like the fact that they might have evolved from some already existing dictionaries like Lingui and so on. So I think the main difference is that DeepL paid a lot more attention to the data, but more in the sense of making sure the data was clean and high quality, whereas Google has this sort of more data hungry approach where they would just get as much data as possible, do some cleaning with it, but not as carefully as DeepL. And I can see in some examples how that makes a difference, but the core technology is very similar. It's pretty much the same. And in terms of like carefully crafting data such that it has a good representation of different genders, ages, and so on, I would say there's pretty much none of that. I mean, the research community is looking into that more carefully now, and we're trying to understand why we get some errors, as in some very classical examples where if you're translating a sentence with a cook, it's generally going to be the gender of that will be a male versus instead of female, or feminine, masculine instead of feminine, and there are many such examples. So we're starting to look at how to prevent this from happening, but that's not what is out there in the online technology. And the last one, in terms of context, again, there's some research in trying to make the amount of text that these models or the systems use as example when they're being built longer, and there is this progress there in general, but it's still unlikely that it will be like an entire, for example, an entire book. It might end up being a couple of pages, and there are various reasons why this is a limitation, and it's not only a compute power limitation, it's a conceptual limitation as well. I expect there will be some progress there, but not to the extent that a machine would be able to read an entire book, sort of understand that book, and then generate a translation after that. It will always have to read bits, translate, read some other bits, translate, read some other bits, and so on.
And there we have also a question for Katy. What do you think are the main reasons machine translation is still anathema for, I think, the majority of literary translations? That's a question by Barbara Spicer. Katy, you have to turn our microphone on.
There we are, human error. Yeah, do you know, I've been thinking about this a lot. And I kind of blame science fiction. I really think that we're imagining the Terminator knocking on our door and gunning us all down. You know, no, I think there's a terrible fear. Duncan, we haven't got time to go into it, but you, in your article, you mentioned the Eliza effect, where we kind of anthropomorphize computers as well as many other things in life, and I think that we're doing that, and that science fiction has fired up our imagination so successfully that we're kind of I know I am worried that there's some terrible entity out there that just wants to take over the whole planet, including my job. Yeah, I think it's fear for our economic survival.
I think if it's any consolation, there's time to adjust. things are changing very quickly on the one hand, but on the other, the kind of usability of machine translation for literary translation is edging forward relatively slowly. There's been talk for a long time in commercial translation of, oh well, post-editing. The future is post-editing machine translation. That's just around the corner, and it's been just around the corner for actually quite a long time now. And I'm sure that's going to be the case for literary translation as well. But I think it's important to raise these questions, to have these discussions now, and just to keep kind of checking back where the technology is, because it can creep up on you if you're not careful.
Thank you. I guess that's unfortunately all we've got time for as far as the questions from the Q&A goes. So back to you, Katy.
Thank you, Gosha. I want to make one little admission, and that is, when you look at the quiz, please do. I was terrified because the human translator, I don't know if I'm credited, but it was me. So I thought it was going to be Kasparov versus Deep Blue, and I was relieved to find that it wasn't when I looked at the quiz. I've learned a lot from both of you today. Thank you so much, Duncan and Lucia. I feel a combination of optimism and relief that perhaps AI will make us better translators, but certainly won't make us obsolete. I'd like to say thank you to Gosha and Anne-Marie for organising the event, and of course Duncan and Lucia for talking to us. Thank you everyone for coming along and for your interesting questions. Sad we didn't have quite enough time to cover them all, but let's hope there are future opportunities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katy. Okay.